It was a Friday night when I received an intriguing message from an old friend, Marcos. He was known for his urban adventures, and this time, he promised something that surpassed all other explorations. An abandoned house on the outskirts of town, wrapped in mystery and sinister stories. The house had belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared decades ago. Since then, rumors of paranormal activity circulated among the locals. The invitation was irresistible. The idea of uncovering the secrets of that place sparked a curiosity that couldn't be ignored. I invited some friends, and soon we were all gathered at Marcos's house, pairing our equipment, flashlights, cameras, and a map of the area. The tension and excitement were high as we discussed the plans for the night. As soon as we arrived at the house, a chill ran down my spine. The decaying facade, covered by vegetation and marked by time, seemed to watch our every move. The full moon partially illuminated the grounds, creating unsettling shadows. The adventure had just begun. Something inside me was already whispering that this exploration would be different from all the others. As we approached the house, the feeling of being watched intensified. Broken windows and the ajar door seemed like open mouths, ready to swallow anyone who dared to enter. I took a deep breath and was the first to cross the gate, closely followed by my friends. The interior was even more disturbing than the facade. Dust-covered furniture, old portraits on the walls, and an oppressive silence that seemed to scream stories of past tragedies. We walked slowly down the main hallway, our flashlights revealing frightening details. Claw marks on the walls, objects fallen as if someone had left in a hurry. That's when we heard the first whisper. A low, indecipherable sound that seemed to come from all sides. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared to comment. We continued exploring, our footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor, each creak making us jump in fright. In one of the rooms, we found an old diary, its yellowed pages filled with frantic notes. As I leafed through it, I realized that it held the key to understanding the mysteries of that house. But the feeling of being watched never ceased, and I knew that the real story was just beginning to unfold. As we flipped through the diary, the air seemed to grow heavier. The notes were confusing, written by someone in a clear state of panic. Suddenly, the temperature dropped abruptly, and the air filled with a metallic smell, like blood. That's when we noticed something strange in the hallways. Shadows moving on their own. They were quick, as if lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness. One of my friends, Luis, pointed to one of the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before we could answer, a deafening noise echoed through the house. A bang, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps upstairs. We stood paralyzed for a moment, our hearts pounding in our chests. Marcos took the initiative and started climbing the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. Reluctantly, we followed him. The upstairs was even darker, and the feeling of being watched grew with each step. We reached a room whose ceiling was partially collapsed, letting in eerie beams of moonlight. In the center of the room, an old rocking chair moved slowly, as if someone invisible was sitting there, rocking back and forth. Suddenly, the chair stopped. The ensuing silence was absolute, except for the sound of our rapid, nervous breath. We felt that something was about to happen, something that would change everything forever. The silence was broken by a whisper that seemed to come from all corners of the room. It was a low voice, almost inaudible, but laden with despair. "Help me," was what we could make out. Luis let out a muffled scream, and Marcos approached the rocking chair, hesitant. As he examined the chair, something shone on the floor. It was an old key, partially buried under a layer of dust. I picked it up carefully, feeling a strange energy emanating from the cold metal. The key seemed to call to us, inviting us to discover what it opened. We went back downstairs, following the intuition that the key belonged to somewhere in the house. We found a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway, almost hidden by shadows. A soft click, key turned in the lock, and the door opened, revealing a staircase that led down to a dark basement. The staircase seemed endless, each step taking us deeper into the darkness. The air grew thicker and damper, and a foul odor filled our nostrils. When we finally reached the bottom, our eyes took time to adjust to the near-total darkness. Marcos lit a flashlight, revealing a basement full of relics and old objects covered in cobwebs. In the corner of the basement was an old wooden chest. We approached it, the tension in the air almost palpable. With trembling hands, Marcos opened the chest, revealing its contents: old photographs, diaries, and bones. Human bones. The shock was immediate, and fear gripped all of us. We felt that we had awakened something that should have remained buried forever. The air in the basement seemed even heavier with the discovery. Chest, an improvised tomb, held more than just mortal remains. It held a presence we felt in every fiber of our being. Suddenly, a deep sound echoed around us, like a wail coming from the depths of the earth. Marcos, always the bravest of the group, picked up one of the old photos from the chest. It was an image of the family that had disappeared, all of them looking directly at the camera with empty expressions and eyes that seemed to follow our every move. As we examined the photos, we noticed something disturbing. In each image, there was a dark figure in the background, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. A sense of panic began to set in. Luis tried to calm himself, but his voice failed when another wave of cold enveloped us. Marcos's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. The silence was oppressive until we started hearing soft footsteps, as if someone, or something, was slowly approaching us. We tried to illuminate the room with our cell phones, but the shadows seemed to close in even more around us. It was then that, in the middle of the darkness, we saw the figure of a man. His face was indistinguishable, but his eyes glowed with a supernatural intensity. He wasn't just watching us, he was studying us. Panic took hold of us. We ran for the stairs, but the steps seemed to stretch infinitely. Each step we took seemed to push us further away from the exit. The sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, accompanied by heavy, irregular breathing. Something told us that if we didn't get out of there immediately, we would never see the light of day again. Finally, we reached the top of the stairs and climbed as fast as our legs would allow. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming. The figure in the darkness seemed closer and closer, and the breathing in our ears became unbearably real. We reached the top and slammed the basement door shut, locking it with the rusty key still in my hand. But the house offered no refuge. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the halls like a cacophony of anguished voices. "Help me. Get out. You shouldn't be here." The words mingled, forming a symphony of terror that drove us to the brink of madness. Marcos suggested we leave the house immediately. Before we could move, Luis found something on the hallway floor, an old newspaper clipping. It headlined the family's disappearance and mentioned rumors of a macabre ritual performed in the house's basement. The article suggested that the family had been involved with forces beyond human comprehension, and something had gone terribly wrong. Looking at the photos from the chest, I began to connect the dots. The shadowy figures, the bones, the whispers. Everything indicated that the family had awakened something that should never have been disturbed, and now we were involved too. The whole house seemed alive, pulsating with a sinister energy that pushed us out. We tried to stay calm as we headed for the front door. The whispers grew in intensity, almost deafening us. When we finally reached the exit, the door slammed shut behind us, as if the house itself was relieved of our departure. But as we looked back, we saw the figure of the man again in the second-floor window, his eyes glowing with a promise that this wasn't the end. Something inside us knew that we had taken a part of that darkness with us, and that our lives would never be the same again. When we finally left the house behind, the sense of relief was brief. That night, none of us could sleep. The whispers, the shadowy figures, the oppressive presence, all of it was still etched in our mind. It was then that Luis, disturbed, decided to research more about the missing family. What he discovered was even more unsettling. In urban exploration forums and urban legend websites, many people reported similar experiences to ours. Some claimed to have seen the same shadowy figures, heard the same whispers. A pattern emerged. Everyone who visited that house was haunted by visions and nightmares, as if something had attached itself to. Luis found an old blog maintained by someone who claimed to be a paranormal investigator. He had visited the house years ago and documented his finding. His notes spoke of forbidden rituals, attempts to communicate with the beyond that resulted in an indescribable tragedy. Family, desperate to bring a loved one back to life, ended up opening a door to something terrible, something that should never have been awakened. In the days that followed, we all began experiencing strange things. Marcos would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and feeling like he was being strangled. Luis saw shadows moving in his room, even when he was alone. I heard whispers, even when everything around me was silent. We tried to meet up again to discuss what to do, but the darkness seemed to be driving us apart. Marcos suggested going back to the house to undo whatever we had unleashed, but the idea was terrifying. We knew that returning might mean facing something even more sinister. As we considered our options, one thing was certain: the house had left its mark on us, and the presence we had awakened was not willing to leave us in peace. The tension was high as we decided to gather our strength to face whatever had haunted us. The idea of returning to the house seemed increasingly inevitable. The feeling of being watched intensified each day, and the unease followed us like a constant shadow. On the night we decided to return, atmosphere was heavy, filled with a strange sense of inevitability. We prepared for what would be our last attempt to solve the mystery. With flashlights, cameras, and equipment in hand, we went back to the house. The full moon illuminated the path, and the house seemed even more sinister under its light. As we crossed the threshold, a cold wind blew, as if the house itself was welcoming us back. The interior seemed darker, the whispers more intense, and the shadows more threatening. We descended to the basement again, now with renewed purpose. The feeling of being watched was almost oppressive. We reached the chest and with trembling hands decided to examine the items inside more closely. We picked up the diaries and photographs, trying to understand what the family had done to cause so much pain and suffering. One of the photos fell to the floor, revealing a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. A strange mark on one of the walls, visible only under the flashlight's beam. The mark looked like a symbol, drawn with what could be dried blood. The presence of bones and ancient objects in the chest made sense now. It seemed the family had attempted some sort of ritual to open a portal to another dimension. And apparently, they had succeeded. Then we heard a sound that nearly stopped our hearts. A sharp, desperate scream coming from within the house. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Panicking, we ran to the hallway, where the figure of the man appeared again. This time, it was clearer, with a face distorted by indescribable pain. Didn't approach, but his presence was so oppressive that we could hardly breathe. The air seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and an invisible force seemed to push us toward the exit. We knew we couldn't stay there another minute. We ran outside, each of us struggling to breathe and understand what we had just experienced. When we finally reached the street, the house behind us seemed even more threatening. The presence we had awakened continued to haunt us, promising that the true battle was far from over. As the days passed, the feeling of terror and the disturbing presence of the house never left us. Each of us faced the effects of that night in different ways. Marcos could no longer sleep without constant nightmares. Luis felt overwhelming anxiety, and I, even in broad daylight, felt an invisible shadow hanging over me. The strange mark in the basement, the symbol drawn in dried blood, began to manifest in unsettling ways. We started to notice that, wherever we were, the marks appeared almost imperceptibly. In our homes, on everyday objects, even in our dreams. It was as if the house had not only marked us physically, but had cast a shadow over our lives. We sought help from paranormal experts and even local historians to understand what we might have triggered. We discovered old accounts of people who had gone through similar experiences and had been victims of something that seemed to be not only a vengeful entity, but also an intelligent one. Over time, it became clear that the house and whatever resided in it were manifesting in our lives, not just as fear, but as an active presence, a presence that seemed to manipulate, torture, and isolate us. We felt the presence of someone or something watching our every move, listening to our every thought, as if we were trapped in a web of terror from which we couldn't escape. We decided to face the situation head-on. We gathered once more and returned to the location. Deep down, We knew what we wanted was to confront what had truly been haunting us. But as we crossed the gate of the house once again, the atmosphere was different. It was more oppressive, heavier with a sense of impending catastrophe. Presence was stronger than ever, and every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into a darkness we never imagined possible. Whatever it was preparing for a final showdown, and we were about to discover, once and for all, what had really been awakened the night we crossed the gate of the abandoned house. As we crossed the gate of the house again, the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with an electric energy, as if the very structure was anticipating our arrival. The air was thick, laden with palpable tension that made our hearts race. We descended into the basement, the area where it had all begun. The chest was still there, but it seemed different, as if it had changed in some way. We decided to confront it again, knowing that what we sought was somehow linked to it. The symbol on the wall seemed to pulse with a faint light, an almost living presence that responded to our approach. Carefully, we opened the chest. Inside, the photographs and diaries were arranged differently, almost as if they had been reorganized. But the most disturbing was the new addition, a piece of paper, an ancient ritual detailed in writing that seemed to shift and change under our light. It was a closing spell, intended to seal what had been released. Marcos, with a trembling voice, began to read the words of the ritual aloud, while Luis and I watched, nervous. As he spoke, the environment around us began to respond. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air grew colder. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the house itself was confronting us, preventing us from finishing what we had started. At the climax of the ritual, a sharp, shrill scream pierced the air. The sound seemed to come from the basement itself, a scream that echoed in our bones and felt like the lament of an entity that did not want to be confined again. The house seemed to shake, and the symbol on the wall lit up with a bright red light. Then the chest began to move on its own, its contents swirling in a chaotic dance. We felt the presence of the entity as a physical force, pushing us and trying to drive us away. Marcos continued to recite the words, his voice now a cry of determination and fear. Finally, with a deafening roar, a red light exploded, and we could see the photos clearly. Unlike the first time we saw the photos containing the images of a family with empty eyes, now the photos were of us. We were in the photos, with vacant and terrifying looks. From that moment, everything happened very quickly. We looked at each other without understanding what was happening, with fear and question. In an instant, we heard a voice behind us, very close, and when we turned around, terrified, we could see the once scary man now with a familiar appearance. The walls were smeared with blood, and our true bodies were mutilated and lying on the floor. If you were captivated by this terrifying experience and want to dive even deeper into stories that challenge comprehension and test the limits of fear, subscribe to our channel. Here, every video is an invitation to explore the unknown, face the inexplicable, and uncover the darkest secrets the world has to offer. Don't miss the chance to follow our next spine-chilling adventures and stories. What lurks in the darkness is only just beginning, and we're here to guide you through the darkest mysteries. Subscribe now and prepare to face the terror that lies ahead.